Today, in preparation for SawCon, the world's largest Saw-related fan convention, I'd like to gush about the second Saw film. The average person will usually tell you one of two things about this series. Either the first Saw is the only good one and all the others are just terrible torture porn, or they're all terrible torture porn. And look, the series definitely earned its reputation after so many cash-in sequels, but what people should be saying is that the first two are the only good ones, and in many ways I actually like the follow-up more than the original. The premise for this franchise is already notorious, but in case you don't know it, they revolve around the Jigsaw Killer, an elusive criminal who's been kidnapping people and challenging them to overcome violent trials he's fabricated. They can either escape or die trying, with the police only arriving to pick up the pieces after the victim has inevitably failed. He justifies his actions under the flawed premise that he's using this trauma as an opportunity to heal each individual he chooses to test, acting as a wake-up call to fix some sort of personal deficiency he sees in them, which he represents as a jigsaw piece he cuts out of their flesh after death. Usually, the films are split between the perspectives of the people trying to escape the situation and the police trying to save them and stop Jigsaw. In the original, it was two guys chained to pipes in a dingy bathroom, given the choice to saw their own feet off or follow the breadcrumbs towards another solution. Part of the appeal is how messy and flawed the scenario is. The stage is set, but once you introduce the unpredictability of human nature and error, so many new variables begin to pop up, making things feel like they're evolving organically. Its low budget ended up being an asset, since all of these elements they couldn't explore kept viewers returning to speculate about its events. I always wondered if in the original they intended for Jigsaw and the person under the pig mask to be the same person, considering he's never shown to be working with anyone and wears a cloak that could be black or red depending on how it's flipped. While there are some interesting traps and concepts in all the films, the only ones I genuinely enjoy are the first two, with the third being a heavily flawed but acceptable conclusion to a trilogy of sorts. These are the only ones I see as having any kind of legitimacy in the series, especially since they were the only three written by Lee Wan-el, who, along with starring in the original short film used to pitch Saw to studios, was also one of the two main characters in the feature film. Recently, he's been gaining traction as a director, with some pretty good films under his belt like Upgrade and the Invisible Man reboot from 2020. But for the original Saw, without the passionate duo of Lee Wan-el as writer and James Wan as director, the film would have never been conceived or realized. Of course, the first movie will always get credit for introducing the concept and being a thrilling movie in its own right, but I feel like Saw 2 is the only one in the franchise where the premise gets to fire on all cylinders. For one, this is the only movie where Jigsaw gets to be Jigsaw. In the first movie, his identity was a mystery, so you only got brief glimpses of him until it was revealed that he was lying there pretending to be dead the entire film. That was an amazing twist that worked for that film, but moving into a sequel which aimed to turn this into a franchise, they couldn't just repeat the same tricks and expect the same impact. Both James Wan and Lee Wan-el were ready to move on to other things, so directing duties were passed to a newcomer named Darren Lynn Bousman, who was already trying to pitch a film he'd written that was getting compared to Saw. Because of the similarities, the script made its way to Saw's producers, who were scrambling to figure out how they were going to come up with a sequel by next year. They decided Bousman's script would make a good starting point for Saw 2, and Wan-el accepted the opportunity to return to adapt and expand it to fit with what was established in the first film. In spite of everything, Saw 2 doesn't feel like a rushed-together sequel made from an unrelated pre-existing script like many other films that share the same trajectory. This is a testament to how dedicated everyone involved was to the project's quality, ensuring this wouldn't be a series that immediately hit a creative dead end. This would be Bousman's first major project, after previously working as a music video director and making some of his own short films, and since it also began as his own script, he was invested and hungry to prove himself. Thanks to its success, he became a series mainstay, directing Saw 3 and 4, as well as returning over a decade later to do Spiral. While all of those pale in comparison to the first two from a writing perspective, they do still have that authentic Saw feel to them that movies like Saw 3D and Jigsaw don't, and I'd credit that to Bousman's involvement. Saw 2 follows Detective Matthews, a burnt-out police officer in the same agency investigating the string of Jigsaw killings. Desk work is piling up alongside a son lashing out at him in the fallout of his wife filing for divorce. He's well respected by his colleagues and eventually gets pulled into Jigsaw's web when one of his informants is found to be the latest victim. In the same room is a note from Jigsaw baiting the detective by name to investigate further. While he's initially apprehensive, the opportunity to uncover and stop the killer is too alluring, and he eventually ties Jigsaw's location to an abandoned factory where he's been getting the metal for his traps. He tags along to watch a SWAT team raid the facility, and you know they're in the right place since it's filled with booby traps that manage to take a few of their lives. While Jigsaw can delay them, he can't stop the full weight of the police force closing in on him, and he's eventually captured. But instead of the untouchable mastermind we were all expecting, what we find is a frail old man sitting in a wheelchair, hooked up to life support, offering no resistance. But before he can be arrested, he informs them that he currently has another game running, which involves the detective's own son. A group of 8 people find themselves trapped in a deserted building, with deadly nerve gas slowly pumping in from the vents. In 2 hours, it'll kill them, unless they're able to complete various tests set up for them around the complex, which will grant them a life-saving antidote. Jigsaw explains that he wants Detective Matthews to sit down and talk to him alone for those 2 hours, and if he can, he'll reunite him with his son. While the other officers work to find the location everyone is being held, he has no choice but to comply, as his son and 7 other victims are being killed from within and trying to keep it together to survive. This setup holds its own in the way it contrasts from what was done previously. All of those dynamic elements I mentioned being positives in the original are here, but amplified due to the more open sandbox structure of the house. While these people still can't just escape, they're free to move around the environment instead of being shackled to a wall, while it's the detective that has to willingly remain in a single room, but without the existence of a physical restraint holding him there. The victims have an entire house to explore for secrets, but you still get that feeling of claustrophobia as they wander around and double back to the same areas, unable to find an exit. While each person has a test intended for them, there's no telling which scenario the group will stumble upon first, if at all, or who will actually complete it. For example, they come across a locked safe containing an antidote, and they have a limited time to find the key, which is buried somewhere in a pit full of old syringes. This test is intended for Xavier, acting as repentance for his years spent as a drug dealer. Instead, he shows his willingness to step on others to get ahead by forcefully throwing another victim, Amanda, into the pit to find the key for him. Amanda is a character returning from the first film who was the only person known to have survived one of Jigsaw's games. She claims the experience cured her drug addiction, which makes this moment even more traumatic for her. A lot of the suffering could be avoided if they worked together or were more patient and observant, since a lot of the traps have deceptively simple solutions. Take this test for a guy named Obi, who worked with Jigsaw to abduct the people for this very game. By climbing into a furnace, Jigsaw gives him the opportunity to get 2 antidotes, one for free since he helped him set this all up, but the second one comes at a price. The furnace turns on only after he grabs the second syringe in an effort to help someone else in the group. The tape had stated that once he's in hell, only the devil can help him out, but he's too panicked to twist the gas valve with a helpful illustration that could save him and secure the 2 syringes. As time goes on, the nerve gas begins to affect their decision making, resulting in even more sporadic behavior. We don't even get to see who this trap was intended for before its note is thrown away. If she wasn't alone when facing this test or examined it closely and noticed the key hanging off the back, she could have easily avoided this much bloodshed. And hey, that's some creative use of color. I sometimes wonder how much this film was an inspiration for franchises like Danganronpa and Zero Escape, and I'd love to play a game based around this open structure and its investigation-based traps rather than the 2 linear Saw games we did get. There's this pitfall the movies begin to fall into starting with the very next one, where the traps are all that matter and there's no real thought put into the areas connecting them. So characters just get funneled through simple hallways to the next set piece to complete, and the connective tissue isn't there. Here, the traps are in service to the setting as a whole, rather than being the sole focus, and the moments of exploration and drama in between are just as compelling because they aren't just filler while loading the next big trap. As things go on, new layers to the scenario are revealed, which change character allegiances and add to the tension, but I'll leave those for you to discover yourself. Point is, the characters have a surprising amount of agency to influence the proceedings, and that wildcard element eventually causes things to unravel in a way Jigsaw couldn't have anticipated. Moving into this sequel, all they had to work with were Jigsaw's modus operandi and the fact that he was a cancer patient, which is how he took an interest in the Doctor from the first film. They could have phoned it in when originally auditioning for Jigsaw, especially since the film only required the character to lay on the floor and speak through a tape recorder for a majority of its runtime. But because they hired such a dedicated actor for the role, even if they weren't thinking about sequels, they still benefit immensely from his unique look and energy. Tobin Bell was so dedicated to the authenticity of the character that he insisted that he would lay on the floor for the 2 weeks it took to shoot, even though they planned on creating a prop body double to set in the middle of the room. While Saw had an iconic twist, I'd argue Tobin Bell and the Jigsaw Killer are horror icons because of how good his role and performance was in this follow-up, where he really got to explore the character's personality and motivations. Several of the films end with the revelation that the main trap actually included the antagonist, but this is the only one where that's not a twist, but the premise established from the start. The whole film is framed with this mind game between these two characters with opposite perspectives, which draws comparison to some of the best psychological thrillers where you want to figure out the antagonist's intentions. Even though Jigsaw is old and fragile, he still holds the power in the dynamic since he controls the fate of the detective's son.
Get me a glass of water. I would very much appreciate that.
It's great to watch play out, since this hothead knows he could destroy Jigsaw physically if he let himself, and he knows he'd deserve it, but he fears the consequences, and that makes Jigsaw feel untouchable. This gives him free rein to lecture the detective on his view of morality and how that ties into his origin. After he learned he had terminal cancer, he attempted to end it all by driving off a cliff, but in spite of it all, he survived, and it made him realize how wasteful he'd been with his time on Earth, choosing to dedicate himself to awakening the survival instinct in others who were slowly letting their lives be eaten away by vices and misdeeds.
We have a human race that doesn't have the edge or the will to survive. The fuck do you want?
What I like is that even if Jigsaw feels justified in what he's doing, the film never presents him as being correct or some kind of anti-hero. He's completely convinced that these extreme actions are necessary, even though they've never been shown to work a single time. I feel like some of the sequels start to buy into their own hype and present him as more virtuous, especially as even worse villains begin to get retconned into existence. But here, it's clear that Jigsaw is a violent zealot that doesn't take responsibility for the outcomes of the imperfect and unbalanced situations he forces people into. This is the only film where we get to watch long scenes of Tobin Bell performing as this character, and the only one that comes close is Saw 3, where he's dying in a hospital bed the entire time. That's kind of the catch-22 of this character. Basing a franchise on a villain with this condition is compelling, but no matter how iconic he becomes, he still has a fast-approaching expiration date that needs to be followed up on. That's what I mean when I say Saw 2 is the only film where we get to see Jigsaw in his prime, and by extension, this is also his most iconic look. His disheveled white hair blends nicely with how pale his skin is, and the red rings around his eyes go well with the coat that frames his face in a visually pleasing way. Thankfully, he dropped that weird goatee he had in the first one, and the less that's said about his look in certain flashbacks in the later films, the better. Because of how well Jigsaw is depicted here, you'll notice we don't see the puppet persona much, and that's something I strongly prefer. I understand the point in using a proxy to intimidate and conceal your identity, but it's still goofy to think about how much extra effort it takes to set up, especially when it rides up on a bike. A simple voice recording would suffice, and that's how it's handled for all the games in this film outside the first one in the cold opening. If Jigsaw's identity isn't a mystery, there isn't really a reason for this puppet to appear anymore. So they rightfully drop it near the start after it makes a brief appearance when the SWAT team triggers that booby trap. As a result, they don't need to contrive a reason for CRTs to be in every room, which would seem weirder with the house's more open structure. As briefly mentioned a moment ago, this is the film that establishes the cold opening kill that would become a series staple, where we're thrown into an intense situation without context, just like the character themselves, and before we can get our bearings, things come to a horrific end, punctuated by the title drop. The Iron Maiden that begins this film feels conceptually consistent with the reverse bear trap from the original, but it's even more disturbing to think someone would cut you open and place something within your head and then ask you to cut it out of yourself. No matter how many times I watch the behind the scenes videos, I can't convince myself that those nails are just rubber, and that's a testament to how good the prop design was. Same goes for how they did these needles. I would have never known it was a fake arm if I hadn't seen the making of. Even in the worst entries, there are still some great examples of practical effects to appreciate, like the water cube from the fifth movie, where they were actually filling it up with water over and over again to get the shot. I like that a majority of the scenarios in this film involve materials that were probably already in this abandoned house, like the furnace, safe, and a hole in the floor. One of the traps that didn't make it into the final film even involved a character pressing their face against a waffle iron. These have a more believable DIY feel than some of the grand, complex instruments of destruction seen in the later films, and I prefer that simplicity, especially when the house itself is like one big game that they're all a small piece of. Both the scenes in the house and those sitting with Jigsaw are compelling in their own way, and feed into each other by providing context for why the other is happening. One moment you're being thrilled in a physical sense by the visceral challenges, and the next you're being psychologically stimulated by the cat-and-mouse dynamic between Jigsaw and the detective. It's a good balance that always keeps you engaged and wanting more of both sides of the story, then it's an eye-opener when they coalesce by the end. Before I give anything else away, I'll just stop myself from gushing now. When I think of Saw as a franchise, I think of this version of Jigsaw sitting at the table because it's his finest moment. Definitely give these first two movies a shot if you've avoided them because of their reputation, and I bet you'll find they have more value than you thought. Then you might as well throw in the third one for a sense of finality, even though it can't hold a candle to the first two. I'm not really someone who enjoys watching the sequels ironically, but I can still spend hours discussing and making fun of all the contrivances and retcons they have. I could probably do some sort of deep dive on the whole series, but this time I only wanted to keep things focused on Saw 2 and how it took the concepts established in the first film and ran with them while they were still fresh.